in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We just kind of got started in chapter 10 last time, and so uh, for sake of clarity, let's just back up a little bit and review. In chapter 9, you remember, it seems that Paul was doing two things in explaining his pattern of self-denial. Hey, I'm an apostle. Don't I have the right to eat and to be financially supported as a preacher of the gospel? To be able to do that, don't I have the right to have a wife, as some of the others have done? And he seems to be doing two things. Number one is showing that what he's asking them to do, he's willing to do. In fact, he's already done. Remember, in chapter 8, he's talked about the idea of eating of meats. And maybe Paul has assumed some objections. Wait a minute. I have the right to eat meat. Why should I, under any circumstances, abstain from that? And Paul is saying sometimes we have to do that, make sacrifices for the benefit of others and for the cause of Christ. And he seems to be saying, see, here's your example. I do that. I do that. But he also seems to be defending himself somewhat against some accusations of not being a legitimate apostle and a legitimate preacher of the gospel. And so he concludes that in chapter 9 by using the sports analogy that of running and of boxing, that you have to discipline yourself. There's some self-control and some self-denial that has to take place if you're going to win the race, is the idea. And so if you're going to win the spiritual race, then you're going to have to make some sacrifices and do without certain things. And so now in chapter 10, he in under the still the umbrella under self-discipline and self-denial, he's saying, look, you are Christians, and he would say that's a good thing, and that's a start. And that's better than not being a Christian, but that's no guarantee. The fact that you were baptized at some point in the past isn't an automatic guarantee that you're going to go to heaven. And even the fact that you go to church every Sunday and partake of the Lord's Supper isn't necessarily a guarantee. Again, he's not saying those aren't helpful, those aren't good, but something still might happen. And so you need to be disciplined and watch for those things. Now, seemingly, they had a little bit of, and certainly we know from what we've read already that this is a mixed race congregation, that there's Jews and Gentiles. And this would certainly have been the case in that Jewish mindset. That was kind of the Jewish mindset, default almost. We're Jews. We're the teacher's pet. We're God's favorite people. And so God's going to condemn the Gentiles, but he likes us. And so we can get away with murder. It was kind of the Jewish mindset, the worst case scenario, negative Jewish mindset. And he's trying to tell them, no, that's not the case. And he's going to use Israel then as his example. There's a saying, and I'm going to butcher the saying, I know, but it's the idea that it's wise to learn from your own mistakes, but it's much better to learn from the mistakes of others. And not repeat those mistakes. And so that's what he's doing here. The others is Israel, the Old Testament, Old Covenant Israel. They had privileges, they had a special relationship with God, but look what happened to them. They fell away. God was angry with them. And so the same thing can happen to you if you're not careful, if you're not on guard. And so he started, and we'll go through this rather quickly because we started this last week. Moreover, brethren, this is 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1. I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers, and so again, he's either talking exclusively to the Jewish audience and using the term fathers in its most literal sense. Now, fathers here would have been what we would say forefathers. And so he's either saying, look, Jews, this happened to your Jewish fathers. or he's using the term fathers in a spiritual sense. In some sense, I'm a Gentile, but Abraham is still my father. Not because I can trace my family tree back to Abraham, but because I can trace my spiritual family tree back to Abraham, Moses, David. All of those are still my fathers in a spiritual sense. And so he may be saying it that way. But all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And we talked about last Sunday, that's talking obviously about the crossing of the Red Sea. There's water on each side of them, and since there's clouds above them, there was water above them. And so he's saying they were baptized. You know, we'd put that in air quotes. They were baptized. That showed that this entrance into this special relationship to God. They all, verse 3, ate the same spiritual food, all ate the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that rock that followed, the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. And so, again, in air quotes, they partook of the Lord's Supper. They partook of the food and drink that God had prescribed for them. And so, in a sense, they were baptized, they partook of the Lord's Supper, and his warning shot would be, and look what that got them. Again, good things, but it wasn't a guarantee for faithfulness. And so now he says, again, we noticed last time, if I'm counting right, 5 times in those first 4 verses, he says the word all. All of them did this. Now look at verse 5. But with most of them, God was not well pleased. And so it's not just a warning, it's a dire warning that they all had this, but the majority, we would say, the majority of them were lost. And so it's not just that if you've got 100 people that were baptized, one of them will be lost. He's saying there's 100 and at least 51. That makes it most, right? Are going to be lost. And so that's scarier, isn't it? To think of 100 Christians, one's going to be lost. Maybe I could cut that, especially I look around and go, oh, he's the one, I'm fine. But when you say 51 out of 100, then I better wake up. Now, let's talk about this. Paul is not a pessimist. Paul, and in fact, if you look at the introduction of this letter to these sorry Christians that are making all these mistakes, he calls them saints. They've been called by God. And so Paul's an optimist. And so he's not a pessimist, and he's not saying it's so tough, just give up. Why are you even trying? That's what Satan would say to us. But he is saying, but you do need to be careful. And so what we need to strike a balance. If this was a sermon, it would be a 2-point sermon. And I would say we need to strike a balance between the danger of overconfidence and the danger of underconfidence. Overconfidence, you get so cocky and arrogant, you think it's not going to happen to me. And that's really what he's dealing with here. And there's a danger in that. But the danger in underconfidence is you just throw your hands up and say, well, what's the point? If most people are going to be lost, that's going to be me. So why even try? And so there's dangers on both sides here. The danger he's warning about here, their present, clear and present danger was overconfidence. Now, and so now he's going to go through a short list of examples of where those covenant relationship people in the wilderness did what was wrong. Verse 6, now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Let's pause and make this quick comment. Studying Old Testament history is really pretty much just studying the mistakes that Israel made, isn't it? We talk about over and over again. I can't believe they worship golden calves, right? And they did that. They murmured and complained when God was feeding them. What? They're terrible people, and they did that, and they did really. They would do. Please understand, that's not the point. That's not why the Old Testament was written, so that we could beat up on the Jews and talk about how sorry they were. The warning is that can be you. Again, learn from their mistakes. And so put yourself in their shoes. So they lusted after evil things as they also lusted. Probably a reference to the story in Numbers chapter 11. All of this is going to be from the wilderness wanderings period, the early part of that. Is when the people began to complain and murmur and weeping against God. Then in verse 7, do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, if you can think about, they've crossed the Red Sea. Remember your Old Testament history here. When did they become idolaters? After they crossed the Red Sea. Yeah, Moses up in the mountain, they cry out to Aaron, they make the golden calf. And so almost immediately in that. And so don't become idolaters. See, they went through a similar thing that you've gone through to be in this special relationship with God. And look what they did. Don't do that. You don't become those idolaters. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 fell. Anybody know what story he's referencing there? Numbers chapter 25. Remember Balaam uh, was bribed to be able to curse the children of Israel, and he basically said, "I can't do that because I can just say what God says, so I can't directly just change the course of history. But here's how you can get them to change. God will curse them, and God will maybe even let me curse them if they do something bad. So you tempt them to commit sexual immorality, and then God will curse them. So I can't initiate the curse. Only God can. And so what you need to do is make them mad, make God mad. And so that's what happened in Numbers chapter 25. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. You remember that story? Still in Numbers. Numbers chapter 21. Remember when they began to murmur and God sent uh, always a strange word to me as a kid, fiery serpents. I thought these were snakes on fire. I thought the only thing worse than a snake is a snake on fire, but fiery just means poisonous. And the newer translations say that poisonous snakes came out and began to bite them because of their murmuring and complaining. They were tempting God in that. We use an expression, or the world does at least, of tempting fate, doing something dangerous, skydiving, is tempting fate, we would say. You're just asking for it. And they tempted God because you're just asking for it. As parents sometimes may say to their children, you just want a spanking, don't you? You're just asking for it. And they were just asking for that. They were tempting God in that regard. Nor murmur, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, that may reference several times in Israel's history after leaving Egypt, but maybe in Numbers 14 is the story in particular that he has in mind about them murmuring and complaining of the things that they have done. And so here's the lesson is, hey, you look at the mistakes they made and you try to avoid those mistakes. And here's what they did. They were arrogant. They thought we're God's special people. God's always going to treat us nice. We don't have to do anything. And he says, no, look, they were baptized. They partook of the Lord's Supper, and most of them died in the wilderness. And so you learn from their foolish mistakes. And again, he repeats, verse 11 kind of reiterates what he had said in verse 6. All these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, on whom the ends of the ages have come. So again, those weren't recorded to be anti Semitic, to just say how bad the Jews were. Those were written as a warning to you that you don't do that. And again, it's the wisest among us that will learn from somebody else's mistakes. I don't know if I've shared this story with you before, but I'm what I would consider very careful with knives, particularly pocket knives. I'm real careful about using a pocket knife, and I will tell you the reason why. When I was a kid, and things are more impressionable when you're a kid, especially when they involve your parents. We were, I want to solidify my level of sophistication in your mind. We were frog gigging. That was, we loved go frog gigging at night. And this one time, my dad and his best friend were with us. Me and dad's best friend's son were out frog gigging, and we broke the handle to the frog gig. And if you know anything about frog gigging, that's kind of important. Frogs are going to jump if you take a fork just in your hand, and so you need a long pole. If we broke that pole, and so Dad said, "Well, we'll just find another one." And so we got out of the boat on the bank of this pond, and Dad found this little sapling that was just straight and long enough, and cut it down. And he got his pocket knife and he was cutting the little twigs and limbs off of it. And he quickly realized that he could pull those off with his hand quicker and easier than he could with his knife. And so he grabs the base of that tree and starts pulling those limbs off, but he still has the open pocket knife in his hand with the blade pointing down. And so you don't get ahead of me. You know where the story goes. So we end up in the emergency room with Dad getting stitches instead of going frog gigging. Uh, and again, being a child and seeing your dad, bleeding and going to hospital in pain really made an impression on me. And so to this day, I'll be doing something like that, with a pocket knife, and then I'll go, oh, and I'll have a flashback, a little PTSD there, and I'll put my pocket knife down. And I probably wouldn't do that if it wasn't for what had happened to my dad. I learned from his mistake. His stitches kept me from getting mine. And so that's what he's saying about Israel. Those things were written not just so we can bash on Israel and say, can't believe they're that. They're written for the sole purpose of saying, don't you do that. You be better than they were. You be careful. And so these were written for our learning, for our example, for our admonition, is the words he uses there. And then he issues, here it gets to the point, the stern warning in verse 12, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. We said this last Sunday and repeat it again. I don't know how anybody who believes the doctrine of once saved, always saved deals with this chapter. There's a lot of chapters and verses in the Bible that contradict that doctrine, but this one certainly does. What's the point of this? Of saying Israel was in a covenant relationship with God, but they fail, and so you better be careful. Be careful of what? I can't fall. And why say take heed lest you fall if you can't fall? This doesn't make sense, does it? And so let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall is the whole point of these stories. Let's not fall as they fell in that wilderness. Nick?
The stories of them, all the miracles that God did in Egypt, they see all of it and they come out. One of the first things they do is start worshiping an idol. And it's hard to fathom that.
Mm-hmm.
Just disregard of what God done for them and what they had seen. Paul's point here is that could be you too.
Yeah.
As bad as that may look, we can't imagine that. Paul had seen a lot during all of his journeys and knew strong Christians, I'm sure, that nobody would ever thought would fell away, and they had.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's telling me, as bad as they were, that could be you too.
Yeah.
Don't get comfortable. Don't think you're too strong. It could be you too.
Yeah, we read those stories, and if we're honest, our tendency is to say, how could they? Like you said, how could they do that after what God's done for them? But if we think about it, it's kind of like people living in the most blessed and prosperous country in the world. It's free from Christian persecution and has everything that God could bless them with, turning around and not being grateful and not blessing us. And we're like, oh, okay, how could they do that? Well, I'm doing it. And maybe even worse because we're blessed better than they are. We don't have bread and water to eat. We've got far better things than that to eat. And so there's that lesson. Glenn?
It said that most of these Corinthians were probably Gentiles. And if that's the case, then, that explains why Paul was going back and going through everything that happened to Israel, because some of these Gentiles probably didn't know this.
Yeah, yeah, they'd had to turn, copy off their neighbor's paper, the Jewish neighbor's paper, to figure who was this? What's he talking about here? But yeah, he would have kind of explaining something the Jews would have known these stories. They wouldn't have liked them, but they would know them. But yeah, the Gentiles kind of refreshing them. Now, again, I want to strike a balance. Paul is not dealing with the other side of this. I think he will, and other New Testament writers will in other places, in other ways, about the danger of underconfidence. And I think the Christians deal with that. And that's a struggle. And that defeatism is dangerous. But right now, he's dealing with their problem, and their problem was overconfidence. You think you stand. And I think the idea here is not you think you stand. Well, they were standing. But I think the idea is you think you're standing and you can't fall. You think standing is a permanent position for you. You better be careful. And I'm going to tell you, there's a danger. Again, if we're preaching a sermon, we do half of it on the danger of underconfidence. But now here's the danger of overconfidence. It's real. Uh, when we lived in the Birmingham area, one of our members there was a master electrician. Bud was his name, and it was always handy to have a master electrician in the congregation because he can fix not just the church's electricity, but come help you with yours. And I can remember while we were there was a story in Birmingham about an electrician who had been electrocuted and died on the job, and that was kind of a big story that happened. And I can remember seeing Bud at services next time, and I asked him two questions. I said, first of all, did you know him? I figured all electricians know each other. And no, not really. I know the company and some of the guys he works with, and kind of maybe knew of him, but he said, I didn't know him. My other question was, I said, well, I assume he was some young kid new on the job and didn't know what he was doing yet. And he laughed and he said, oh, no. He said, the young electricians will never get electrocuted. It's us old guys. Uh, and and he explained that. He says that new electrician, he's scared to death of that electricity. And so he's going to check and test and flip. He's going to turn that breaker off, all the breakers off, and shut the main power to the building. And then still test it and still ground himself and he says it's us old guys that have been doing this for decades and never been electrocuted, and so we just like, I've got this. And I thought about that, and that stuck with me, and that's kind of true. I mean, it's not a 100% rule, but it's kind of true, isn't it? It's that overconfidence of that electrician. I've done this. I've dealt with this before. I've never been electrocuted. I never even have been years since I've even been shocked. So, and they go do that thing, and they don't turn off the power when they probably should have, or don't check. And that's the warning here of these Christians. Again, not diminishing the warning that needs to be given for underconfidence, but you get so arrogant and cocky to think you can't fall that you are ripe for a fall. So let him who thinks he stands, we might say who's forever going to stand, take heed lest he fall. No temptation, he adds, has overtaken you except such as common to man. Now let's break this verse down. The first one is it's common to man. Um, I think I know what that means, but how does that help? I think verse 13 is a helpful verse, and so that every temptation is in other words, he's saying the temptations you face aren't unique. People are facing the same thing, one way or another, to one degree or another, out there in the world. So that's the meaning of it. But how is that helpful? Or is it helpful?
Let people know that it can happen and they can overcome it.
Yeah, everybody's dealing with it, and you can overcome it.
That's what I said.
Yeah.
Everybody's in the same boat.
Yeah. It's not you. God's not asking. He hasn't singled you out and said, overcome this one. It's what others and. Oh, Larry, go ahead.
1 in 3 million people get. I've never seen this before. That's a different feeling. Yeah, I got 20 of these today.
Yeah,
Fix
yeah, and I've cured at least most of those. You want to hear that, and so I think the implication here is not just it's common to man, and so what you're facing is not extraordinary, and I think the inference is that some have overcome it, and so can you. And so no temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. So there's some comfort that you're not in a unique, more difficult situation than anybody else. Here's even more comforting, but God is faithful. God is faithful. And I think maybe that's an intentional phrase, and it's not just saying the obvious, and the obvious is God is faithful, but with temptation, what are we asked to do? To be faithful. And so we're faithful and God is faithful. And so God's not asking you to do something that everybody else isn't also having to deal with, but He's also not asking you to do something that He's not doing. He's asking you to be faithful. Well, He's faithful to you. Adam?
Get keep us from wallowing in our own self-pity, whatever it is that we're going through, whether it's, had a tire blow out in the car or whatever. It's like nobody else has ever had that happen, because it happened to us. Oh, it had to be raining and it had to be, and we wallow and
Yeah.
oh, it's so terrible. And we forget about all the things God's brought us through before. He brought us through so much worse than that. He saved us from so many things that we forget about in the moment that we've got to, oh, this is just so terrible. Why did I stubbed my toe again today? Why did And I think it works both ways. It should help us, to understand other people are doing it. We're not alone, but also we're not special. This is, your situation is not worse. Look back 10 verses. Our situation is not worse.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there is comfort in that. Yeah. Yeah. And don't mire in that self pity, that pity party. So God is faithful. He's asking you to be faithful. Well, the good news is He is faithful. And here's how His faithfulness is exhibited. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. Uh, there's always the ability to overcome that temptation. I think we've stretched this a little bit. Sometimes people say, God won't give you more than you can handle. And maybe there's some connection there, but he's not really talking, he's just talking about temptation here. That temptation is not unovercomable. You can do it. Others have done it, and you can too. And so God's put a governor on Satan, if you will, and sin and temptation, that he can't do something that is impossible for you to overcome. And so he hasn't done that. Here's what he has done, but with the temptation will make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. And so God's given you a way out of that. We're going to talk more about that, by the way, in our sermon this morning. That's kind of based off this idea of dealing with temptation. And so God has given us that way of escape. And so overconfidence, and then kind of deals with the underconfidence there in verse 13. You can do this. You can overcome this temptation. Nick?
I think most of us, when we talk about resisting temptation and not falling to temptation, what comes to mind is resisting. Man, it don't bother me. I was tempted, but it don't bother me. What most of us don't want to admit or don't want to have to do is flee from it.
Yeah.
It feels like it's worse if you had to flee from it. But God's given us both here. He's given us the ability to resist something, and everybody has some sin that is harder for them to resist than others. And if it's one that's really hard for you to resist, He's gave you a way out.
Yeah.
Take the way out. Don't let your pride say, "No, I can resist it," and then not be able to. He's also given us the way to escape, and it's not a bad thing to take the escape.
Yeah.
Both of them are things He's given us.
the way of escape, you're right, and that's a good point. The way of escape can be either the strength to withstand it or the wisdom to get out of Dodge, before that becomes maybe an unsurmountable temptation. Adam?
Part, what isn't said is that God is faithful. He won't allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape. You may be able to bear it. God does allow, and the devil will certainly tempt us beyond what we want to escape. Oh, well, yeah, no, this is getting awful hard. I guess I just have to give in. There's a want, we can,
Mhm.
but how bad do we want to escape that temptation when it comes down to it? We know we ought to, but oh well, no, actually, and that cake's half off today.
Yeah.
I just can't bear it anymore.
This one time, maybe. Yeah.
How much we want to get away.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now in verse 14, we're not shifting gears by evidenced by the word therefore. In other words, we're just continuing here. Now it's the application, maybe. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. A couple things about that is it seems we've made a shift from chapter 8 to now in chapter 10. Chapter 8 was dealing with this mindset of what we assume were Gentiles who had obeyed the gospel, who were now so repulsed by that idolatrous lifestyle that they wouldn't even eat meat because that in their mind was somehow attached to that. And so we've got those people that just seem like they've swung the pendulum of avoiding idolatry and maybe gone too far, if you can say it that way, to now in chapter 10, he seems to be dealing with the others in the congregation. We are assuming Gentiles, as Glenn pointed out earlier, that wanted to do both, wanted to have one foot in Christianity and one foot still in the old idolatrous world. And so, one thing that tells us, what we already know, is that congregations are complicated. We're not monolithic, we're not all the same. That even among the same ratio economic category, that these were the Gentiles, and you're going to think, well, all the Gentiles were the same. And we kind of tend to think that way in the group think, especially historically speaking. It's sometimes the best we can do because we didn't know these individuals. We think all the Gentiles were the same. Well, no, here were some Gentile Christians who wouldn't even eat meat because it might have been contaminated by an idol. But apparently in chapter 10, we've also got some Gentile Christians that were still worshiping idols, going to the temple and doing all those kind of things. And so again, things are complicated, aren't they? And so he's going to address that mentality that you could serve God and serve idols as well. But I also want to key in, and again, we'll do this in our sermon on that word flee. And Nick talked about that. No, Adam talked about it. I'm getting confused here. About well, maybe both of you did. I don't know. I'm confused. Anyway, y'all know who you are. Uh, of the idea of just you need to absent yourself from the situation. And I think we all understand that Paul means this flee in kind of a metaphoric sense, but there's nothing wrong with also seeing it in a literal sense. Just run away. We see that phrase at least 3 times in the New Testament. Flee idolatry, flee youthful lust, and flee fornication. Now, I'll share with you a bad joke. I'm full of bad jokes, but when I was this is a preacher joke, which makes it even worse. So when I was at Florida College, the joke one of my professors told is that the smallest sin in the Bible, and then he gave you the Bible reference to flee fornication. So you'll have to think about that for a minute. But anyway, flee, run away from, just get away from it. Is the idea. And certainly when you say the idea of flee fornication, I think of the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, that he literally fled fornication. And sometimes it may mean that. I think it means more than that. It means to avoid it, certainly, mentally, emotionally, and all that. But it sometimes may mean I just got to leave. I can't be here. And to Adam's illustration about the cake, if you're on a diet, maybe hanging out at Krispy Kreme isn't the best place to be. Just don't go there. If you know that's going to be a temptation. And so the idea of physically getting out of that situation is certainly admirable. Now, I speak. Oh, sorry, Mark. Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's a pretty good adage there. If bad things are going to happen, don't be there. And that's your way of escape. And we don't know. Escape may be you just never in the danger. That's your escape, is you just never put yourself in that place of danger. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. I think that's just a little bit of a confidence booster. You know this. You know better than this. You can figure this out. The cup of blessing, verse 16, which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? Now, obviously, he's alluding to the Lord's Supper here. The cup of blessing is the communion of the blood of Christ. And he's further going to clear that up for us if there's any confusion. But the communion with the blood of Christ, I think, tells us he's talking about the cup of the Lord's Supper. The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? And so let's talk a little bit about that. The Lord's Supper, talking about the bread is the body, the cup, the contents. And by the way, again, you know this, our brethren, our what we call our one cup brethren, fail to see the use of language here, that the word cup is not talking about the cup. It's talking about the content that's in the cup. That's a figure of speech. And so when he says the cup, and here's how I know that, the cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? Well, the cup is not the blood of Christ. It's what's in the cup. And so there's, again, that figure of speech. And so he's talking about the contents, the juice, the fruit of the vine. It's the blood, and the bread is the body of Christ. And he uses a word that we're very familiar with in verse 16, but maybe we don't think about it a lot, and that's the word communion. In fact, we sometimes will call the Lord's Supper the communion. But communion, this is the same word that's translated fellowship. And it just means a sharing in or a participating in. And what it's saying here is that when you're eating that bread and drinking the contents of that cup, you're not just eating bread and drinking from a cup. And you're also not, and we could peel away the layers of this spiritual onion, we're not just remembering the body and the blood of Christ. We're doing that, but that's one layer. But the other layer here, and maybe the most inner layer, is you are sharing, you're participating in that. So it's not just doing something, and it's not just using it as a recall to memory. You are participating, you're sharing in that. And so this is a spiritual experience. It isn't just a physical thing. And again, we know this, that this is a spiritual experience, that you're participating in his body and his blood. You're sharing in that. You're partaking of that. And let me make this point. We've let some and we do this on several levels. We allow people to steal things from us. I think we've allowed much of the religious world to rob us of the Holy Spirit. We're afraid to talk about the Holy Spirit because we'll sound like them. And we do certain things like that. And I think we've allowed some who the doctrine of consubstantiation or transubstantiation is the belief that when you put that bread in your mouth, it literally becomes the body of Christ, and the juice literally becomes the blood of Christ. And we've allowed that mistaken notion to scare us away from what Jesus didn't say what we often say at the Lord's Supper. This is a representation. Jesus said, this is my body. He didn't say this represents my body. He didn't say this represents my, he said this is. Now, again, let me say, I'm not teaching the doctrine of transubstantiation or consubstantiation, but it's more than just bread. It's more than just grape juice. It's the body and the blood of Christ. Again, not in some literal sense in that, but there's a deep meaning to it. And it's not just bread. It's the body of Christ. And so he's building that as a foundation for now. How does that it's inconsistent now to do that and to do that, which is idol worship. But we've run out of time, and so we'll pick up there next time.